Fantastic. We are live again. Okay, so, hey, if you are new, if this is the first time you've watched, welcome. I am a narrator. I narrate as Rafe Beckley. I also narrate as Piers Ryman. Currently narrating as Rafe Beckley, the third in a series of 5 books by Harriet Knowles. This one is called The Wrong Brother. They are Pride and Prejudice variations. Darcy and Elizabeth served up in multiple new ways. I am going to share my screen with you so you can see what I see while you listen to what I do. Just doing that now. If this is your bag, if you're watching it now or later on, don't forget to like and subscribe and do all that stuff that I'm told I have to ask you to do. I don't know. I'm a middle-aged man. I don't get this stuff. Yeah, you are currently looking at my screen. You can see the text in the middle of the screen. We're at chapter 14 at the moment. On the left bottom, you can see here, this is the digital audio workstation. I work in Reaper. There are others available. Above that, you can see part of the Reaper program as well. If I switch here to the other project, that's where I store the character voices. And you can see I can go back and check anybody's voice within from chapter to chapter and within books as well if I need to, so that the voices are all consistent. Other than that, away we go, really. If this is your bag, if you're watching it now or later as well, invite your friends, bring them across. Why not? If anybody who's interested in how the sausage is made, you can check me out pretty much every day, Monday to Friday. When I'm on, I'm generally on. I'm a little bit early today, but I'm always on around about 1 GMT or British time, whatever, about 2 o'clock European time, which is about 8 a.m. Eastern Standard. If you've got any comments, you can stick them in the live chat. If you're watching this after the event, then you can just comment on the video if you want to. I will get back to you. If you have any requests, drop them in, ask me. I'm more than happy to answer questions or bugger about and have some fun. So, on that note, get my moustache out my way. Yes. Okay, away we go. Chapter 14. Elizabeth leaned out of the coach window. "We are nearly there, Jane." She sat back against the cushions and smiled at her sister. "I think it was a good idea to come to London, don't you?" "You were very insistent, Lizzie." Jane laughed. Oh, let's get a little sense of the laughter in that line then. "I think it was a good idea to come to London, don't you?" "You were very insistent, Lizzie." Jane laughed, but a tiny worry line creased her brow. "But I am anxious as to how you think we can inform Mr. Bingley that we are staying with our aunt." "We'll think of something, Jane, I am sure of it." Elizabeth didn't feel quite so sanguine about it, but she had been able to think. But she had been able to think of nothing else but to get to London somehow and find out how Mr. Darcy was faring. No matter how firmly she had told herself that she must not be involved, must hold her heart secure from him, nothing had worked. Papa would never consent for her to be married to a man without fortune enough to keep her, and Mr. Darcy had been brought up in a wealthy family. He would not wish to have to work for a living all his life. He must marry a lady of fortune. But her heart was disobedient. The life of an officer's wife would be tolerable. Diction. The life of an officer's... stamping all over my cues. The life of an officer's wife would be tolerable, she supposed. She could be good at that if she put her mind to it. But her mind would push the thought away. How could she wish that for him? The risk in war-torn years was too great. She would be fearful for him the whole time. And now this had happened. He had not been expected to survive, but it seemed the surgeons were now hopeful he might yet recover. The coach slowed down and turned into Gracechurch Street. She must push away all thoughts of Mr. Darcy and concentrate on greeting her aunt. Aunt Gardiner was an astute lady, and Elizabeth. Aunt Gardiner was an astute lady, and Elizabeth didn't want to be discovered. But would he recover? Would he ever be well enough to remain as a soldier? What would he do if he could not work again? She might not know him well, but one thing she was certain of was that he would resent it if he needed to be supported by his older brother. She wondered if she could ever save enough to make a difference. No, she knew it to be impossible, but she had her ideas. She smiled a little. Papa had been encouraging and had promised to keep her secret. She was writing a little children's book. When it was finished, she would prevail upon Jane to illustrate it for her, and then Papa would assist her to get it printed. Somehow she would be able to recoup the investment and make a little extra, she was sure. And while she was here with her aunt, she might try out her ideas for new tales when helping settle the little Gardiner children. Stories for boys. That might be a good idea. Most mothers and governesses might be more at ease with inventing tales to please little girls, and would appreciate a book of stories more suitable for young boys. Pirates, perhaps, or soldiers. She smiled. Perhaps she might be able to ask someone she knew how to make them sound more realistic. "Lizzie!" Jane's voice finally penetrated her introspection. Her sister dug her elbow into her side. "I have been talking to you for several minutes. Several minutes," not her voice. "I have been talking to you for several minutes." "Oh!" Elizabeth was startled. "I am sorry." Dismayed by her lapse, she sought to cover it. "I think I was about to go to sleep, so it is as well we have arrived." Aunt Gardiner was standing on the step, waiting to greet them, far enough away not to have noticed, Elizabeth was pleased to note. But she followed her sister down the step of the coach and hurried towards the house. "Aunt Gardiner, thank you so much for saying we might come and stay with you. We have been happily anticipating it, haven't we, Jane? I love having you here, you know that." Aunt Gardiner shepherded them. Aunt Gardiner shepherded them. Ooh, shepherded them. Yep. Aunt Gardiner shepherded them indoors. It is, not it's. "It is getting very cold outside now. You must come in and get warm." Jane shivered a little. "It was cold in the coach, I will admit." She gave a sly look at Elizabeth. "But Lizzie. But Lizzie didn't seem to notice." Elizabeth didn't acknowledge the glance. "You know I don't feel the cold as you do, Jane, but I would welcome a cup of tea." Aunt Gardiner nodded at the housekeeper and waited while they handed their hats and coats to the waiting servant. They followed her into the drawing-room, a quiet, gracious room which always calmed Elizabeth, even when the children were there. She would love a home of her own one day, just like this. She suddenly realized the truth of the matter. She could not have it this way, if she let her feelings for Mr. Darcy run away with her as they had been doing. Lost in her thoughts, she sipped at her tea, staring at the fire. Had she been mistaken to bring her sister to London without telling her the real reason? Jane nudged her again. "Lizzie, Aunt is speaking to you." Elizabeth shook her head. "I'm sorry." She smiled apologetically at her aunt. "I was in a dream, I think." Aunt Gardiner placidly passed her a plate with a pastry. "That much was obvious, Lizzie. I was asking what you plan to do while you were here. The children are desirous of occupying all your time here, if they can manage it." But her gaze was thoughtful as she looked at Elizabeth, who knew she must be more careful. She bit into the pastry. "We want your assistance, Aunt." She glanced sideways to her sister. "Don't we, Jane?" Her sister's blush pleased her enormously. It would distract from her own introspection, she hoped. Has Has Jane told you... I stomped on my cue. Has Jane told you of the gentleman who has been calling... come on. Don't let it go now. Has Jane told you of the gentleman who has been calling on her? Jane gave her a sly look. And his friend, Lizzie. We mustn't forget to tell Aunt about Mr. Darcy, too. Okay. Turn that into a region. Turn that into a chapter. Label the chapter. Save everything. Have a cheeky sip of cranberry juice. Slightly acidic. Well, not slightly acidic. It's very acidic. Produces mouth noise, and it's quite nice. There's no vodka in it, sadly. Here we go. Chapter 15. At last, Darcy was going back to the officers' mess. It was not a moment too soon, and he had been irascible and bad-tempered since recovering his senses a week ago. He wanted to be able to have callers, his sister and Bingley as well as Richard, and he wanted the chance to leave the stultifying atmosphere of Carlton House. He had been obliged to make his way to the prince's presence more often than he liked, and it had been hard to be properly deferential. He was uneasy. Would he ever recover full fitness? His arm was abominably stiff and difficult to move. Mr. Barry was careful with his prognostications, although he did say it would be many months before the effects would wear off enough to be certain that no more improvement could be expected. In fact, he would not even state with certainty that the circulation to the hand would improve enough for him to rule out amputation. Oof, running out of breath there. In fact, he would not even stomped on my cue. In fact, he would not even state with certainty that the circulation to the hand would improve enough for him to rule out amputation. Darcy had stopped asking questions after that. He would not accept the answers. Meanwhile, he grimly forced his arm to stretch in all directions as often as he could, and pushed from his mind the fear that the wound might reopen. He smiled wryly. It was not a pretty sight. He hoped profoundly the scar might fade in time from the current red and angry-looking line zigzagging down his arm. However, it was nearly time to go. He pushed his arm into the sleeve of his next-best uniform jacket and tried to wriggle his right arm in. "Sir," the young subaltern hurried to him. "May I assist you?" "Let me try, damn it." Darcy struggled for a few more moments and eventually succeeded, although sweating with pain. He submitted to the young man, straightening his collar. "I am sorry. I have been a difficult man to be around, I suppose." The subaltern smiled slightly. "If you are in discomfort, it must be hard to stay amiable." "Yes." Darcy did not like to say he doubted he had ever been of an amiable temperament. "Thank you for your efforts." He was surprised when the lad straightened up, looking proud. "Thank you, my sir." Darcy puzzled over what he said. Darcy puzzled over what he had said as he sat down and sloshed a little whisky into the tumbler. He had time for a drink before Richard would arrive with his father's coach to take Darcy back to their quarters. Then his cousin was there, brandishing a copy of the London Gazette in his hand. "Have you seen this, Darcy? Were you expecting it?" "What?" Darcy was puddled. We've all been puddled, Darcy. Darcy was puzzled. "What is in it?" "You don't know? He gave you no warning?" Richard sounded disbelieving. "What do I not know?" Darcy felt irritated. "You will find out later." The surgeon was there. Just check he's urbane, I remember. Mr. Barry, the surgeon. Ah, Colonel Darcy. There we go. Gentlemen, you need to handle Darcy. I'm happy to. Yes. Let's. You will find out later. The surgeon was there. Gentlemen, you need to leave now while the day is at its warmest. I have sent word to the regimental surgeon, and you will. Oh no, that's. Eh? The surgeon was there. Hold on, what's going on here? You will find out later. This is definitely Colonel Fitzwilliam, the surgeon, was there. Yeah, no, that is. Yeah, that is. That's right. That's the correct person saying it. Yeah, that's right. I have sent word to the regimental surgeon, and you will find he is waiting for you. He bent a stern eye on Darcy. Do not expect too much too soon. He turned away. Now, go quickly, before events overtake you. Darcy looked at Richard, bemused, but his cousin shook his head. Come on, Darcy, let's get away while we can. He hurried him down the short corridor and out to the coach. The cold air knocked the breath out of Darcy's lungs, and he realised how long it had been since he had been out of the overheated palace. He could not allow himself to give in to weakness, however, and he turned to his cousin the moment the coach door was closed on them. I have no doubt the mess is as full of intrigue as Carlton House. Tell me what I need to know while we have some small opportunity of privacy. Richard looked grim. He turned the closely printed pages of the Gazette and folded it back to one of the pages near the front. Oh, that was a bit. And folded it back to one of the pages near the front. Darcy frowned. Another promotion, perhaps. But when Richard handed him the periodical. But when Richard handed him the periodical, the page heading was Civil Promotions, not Military. His own name sprang to his attention. Darcy Fitzwilliam, created Earl of Falmouth. His heart stopped. How could the prince have done this without even informing him? Now he had a large target on his back for George's jealousy and bitterness. Oh, wonderful. He screwed up the periodical and flung it across the coach, scowling. How can I prevent it? You cannot. Richard's face was equally grim. Everyone knows now. You are probably the last to hear of it. Darcy smiled mirthlessly and leaned back against the cushions. He glanced at Richard. No one will believe I have no wealth now, and soon I will not if I have to pay for protection from George. He closed his eyes. I must think. His cousin was silent, and after a moment Darcy opened his eyes and looked over at him. What are your thoughts? Richard shrugged. I don't know what you are to do, Darcy. I think you are safe enough while you are confined to quarters with your injury, but as soon as you begin to be seen around town, it will— I am not staying in hiding, Richard. Darcy glared at him. As a beginning, I want to call on Georgiana. She needs to see that I am well. I have been as reassuring as I can be, Richard nodded, and it has been easier for her once I told her that you had regained your senses and we're being— drop in that. I have been as reassuring as I can be, Richard nodded. I have been as reassuring as I can be, Richard nodded. And it has been easier for her once I told her that you had regained your senses and were being a difficult patient to treat. He grinned. She was certain it meant you were back to being your usual self. He sat up, looking serious again. Do not leave the barracks just yet, Darcy. Let my mother bring Georgiana to the ladies' lounge and see her there. It will be better for all concerned, I think. Perhaps. Darcy closed his eyes again. When would this confounded weakness wear off? And the cold. Why did he feel the cold so much? It was only a short journey to the barracks, and soon the coach turned alongside the gracious building that housed the officers. Darcy would be glad to get inside. Earl of Falmouth. Why in heaven's name had Prinny done such a thing? It was a disaster for him, although he supposed, as he tried to stride along the corridor, the prince was not aware of the danger he'd put Darcy in. "Good morning, Lord Falmouth." A servant bowed. "May I take your coat?" Lord Falmouth. Darcy shook his head. "Not at present. I am cold." The man looked concerned. "I will have the fires made up, my lord. Where will you be sitting?" Darcy glanced at Richard, who smiled slightly. "Let us sit in the small club room, Darcy. It will warm up more quickly for you, unless you want to go to your chamber." Darcy shook his head quickly. "No, the small club room will do very well." He turned to the servant. "Thank you. I would appreciate the fire being stoked. And coffee, please." He rolled his eyes at Richard, and they walked together through to the dark wood-panelled room that he knew would be empty at this time of day. Richard chuckled. "I wish you could have seen your expression when he called you Lord Falmouth." He looked thoughtful. "I wonder what father will think of it." Darcy was startled again. "He still outranks me." He tried to laugh, but snip me. He tried to laugh, but the news was still too recent. "Georgiana will be delighted for you." Richard tried again. "Yes." Darcy leaned back in the comfortable wing-backed leather chair, trying not to shiver. He had a sudden image of Elizabeth as the Countess of Falmouth, and he jerked upright again. He must not do this. He'd been trying to stop thinking of her for the last week, determinedly pushing aside every thought of her face, her figure, but her image was in his mind each time he woke, and he was afraid those around him might have heard him if he had called her name aloud in his dreams. He shuddered. No, he was in the club room with Richard, and he must keep his mind on matters of immediate importance. His cousin was gazing at him curiously. "Perhaps you ought to go to your chamber, Darcy. You may feel more yourself again when you have rested." "I have had enough rest to have done me good if it was going to," Darcy growled. After a moment longer, he sighed. "I am sorry, Richard. I am poor company, I know. Let's change the subject and see what I have missed." Richard smiled and sat back slightly. He glanced at the room. They were alone. "Well, Georgiana spends a lot of time at Matlock House these last weeks. I think she had hoped that George would go back to Pemberley, but I think he is settled in Darcy House for the season." His eyes were hooded. "He is not behaving well, Darcy, and your father is beside himself at the disgrace to the Darcy name." Darcy grimaced. "There is nothing we can do. I know that, and yet I do not have to like it. Perhaps I can mitigate the damage somewhat before Georgina takes her season, and George's behaviour might have been forgotten." He must not think about Elizabeth Bennet again. Georgiana would need him to marry well, to be introduced to the higher levels of society. Georgiana would need him to marry well, to be introduced to the higher levels of society. Georgiana would need him to marry well, to be introduced to the higher levels of society, despite George's attempt to drag their name to the gutter. Richard was still watching him. "I wonder if we can force him to marry. It might help." Darcy flickered a glance at him. "I think it would make no difference. He is immoral and without principles. I cannot imagine any young lady accepting him, even with all his prospects. She would be laughed at." "Oh, Darcy, surely Pemberley and his vast income makes him very eligible." "At first, perhaps, if he is in the mood to be charming and amiable, his looks and wealth and his manner are in his favour. But I would feel very sorry for any lady who fell for him." He shuddered at a brief image of George paying attention to Miss Elizabeth Bennet. No, he would not allow it. He sat forward again. "Georgiana, father, Bingley. I need to meet with them as soon as I can. Are you able to arrange it for me over the next few days, Richard?" His cousin nodded. "When you have—" Oh, no, it's still him. No, it is him. "When you have finished your coffee—" Oh, it's stamped on the stamped on the cue. "When you have finished your coffee, perhaps you'd write a short note to each, and I will ensure they are delivered promptly." He looked curiously at Darcy. "Your friend Bingley turned up more than a week ago. Having not heard from you when he expected to, he wrote to me, and I told him what had happened to you. He was in London the next day asking if he could be of service to you." Cheeky little burp. Darcy smiled faintly. "He is a good friend." He thought Bingley might have news from Longbourn from before he had come to London. He wondered if the Bennet sisters had even heard what had happened. That'll do. That's a nice cheeky chapter. Chapter 15. Get that saved off. File. Save it. Sip the slurp, and then on we go. Okay. Chapter 16. It was 3 days since they had arrived in London, and Elizabeth, let's say your name right. Chapter 16. It was 3 days since they had arrived in London, and Elizabeth was, to her frustration, no further forward in knowing what was going on. She leaned over the society pages of her uncle's newspaper, but she didn't really know what she was looking for. "Lizzie?" Jane had come into the sitting room. She came closer and lowered her voice so that their aunt might not hear. "Lizzie, what idea did you have that we could indicate to Mr. Bingley that we were here in London? I am concerned he will go back to Netherfield, and we won't be there if he calls." Elizabeth sighed and folded up the newspaper. She wanted to know Mr. Darcy's fate, but she must reassure her sister. London had been the best place to be. "Let's take some tea." She lowered her voice too and took her sister's arm. "Mr. Bingley will still be in London. You could see how affected he was at the news of Mr. Darcy, and it seems they are very close friends. He will be here while he thinks he might be of service to his friend." She smiled slyly. "But he was still anxious that you did not feel he did not care equally what you thought of him." Jane blushed. "Yes, but if he does know—" "But if he does not know," Jane blushed. We can leave that in. "Yes, but if he does not know I'm here, then all is wasted." "It can't all be wasted. You know the children love having you here, and it is a lovely change for us to be away from Longbourn for a while." She squeezed her sister's arm. "We will be going back to Longbourn with Aunt and Uncle for Christmas, and I am convinced that if Mr. Bingley does go to Hertfordshire, he will hurry back here as soon as they tell him where you are." "I wish we had stayed in Hertfordshire, Lizzie. I might have been invited to take tea with Miss Bingley, and she would have told me if there was news of him." Elizabeth shook her head. Her sister could think no ill of anyone, but it was certainly obvious to anyone else that Miss Bingley did not approve of Jane for her brother. It had been part of her plan to be here because she had been certain that Miss Bingley would have followed her brother to London. Then they could have called on her. But when they called, the butler looked down his nose at them and said Miss Bingley was not at home. "Let me have another day to think about it, Jane. The first idea didn't work, I know, but I'm sure I will think of something. Come along, girls. The tea is getting cold, and we have not had a good Come along, girls. The tea is getting cold, and we have not had a good conversation this morning." Aunt Gardiner's voice called their attention, and Elizabeth forced her mind away from the thought of a gravely wounded Mr. Darcy. That afternoon, she might have to slip out of the house and see what was to be done. "Shall I pour the tea, Aunt?" She reached for the teapot, and her aunt looked at her a little suspiciously. Elizabeth knew she must act her old self, as if she was unworried about anything in her life. After lunch, she told Jane she was going to take a short walk to the little park at the end of the road. The weather was bitterly cold, and Jane didn't offer to accompany her. But Elizabeth had to discover something, so she put on her warmest coat and walked as briskly as she could while still trying to appear ladylike. She had looked at the shortest routes and decided to take some of the less well-known streets. That meant it was less than 3 miles from the unfashionable end of Cheapside to the wealthy West End. She was, as Darcy would say when she arrived at Darcy House and called on her, and for just a moment her determination failed her. What would she say? "Dear Miss Darcy, you don't know me, and your brother barely does, but, although I am only a country miss, I am concerned for him. Could you tell me how he is, please?" She laughed out loud at her thoughts. No, it would certainly not do. She had barely half an hour left to concoct a tale that might gain her... To concoct a tale sounds wrong, but it's right. She had barely half an hour left to stomped on my cue again. She had barely half an hour left to concoct a tale that might gain her entry. It was too soon for her to have planned her little speech when she arrived at the very imposing front door, and her spirits quailed a little as she climbed the steps. But she was determined. A gentleman's daughter could call on a lady. At least in the country it was possible. She hoped devoutly that the town would not be against it. The door opened to her knock, which sounded too timid even to her own ears. A magnificently dressed butler stood inside. "Where's Darcy Butler, London? Butler, Darcy, London." Mr. Darcy, Colonel Fitzwilliam. Mr. Darcy, Colonel Fitzwilliam. He's a long-suffering butler, I think. Okay. "Yes, madam." It's a question. Yes. "Yes, madam." Her chin went up. "Miss Elizabeth Bennet to call upon Miss Darcy." She took a step forward to show she was not intimidated. The butler looked down his nose at her. "Miss Darcy is not at home, madam." Elizabeth felt dashed, but she didn't hesitate. "Perhaps you might inform me when it will be most convenient to call?" "Miss Darcy is from home, madam. Perhaps you would care to leave a card, and what your call is concerning." Elizabeth gave him a withering look. "It is a private matter. No doubt if Miss Darcy wishes you to know, she will tell you." She nodded sharply. "Very well. I will call again tomorrow, and each day, until you can tell me when she might be expected." "Goodness, Elizabeth, you have certainly made yourself unwelcome." She berated herself. Such an attitude was unlikely to get her admitted. She turned away from the door and caught sight of a gentleman standing in the doorway to what must be a drawing-room beyond. He had an open, easy smile and an amiable expression. Light brown hair, unruly around his ears, and an approving look in his eyes as he looked her up and down. He was dressed in highly fashionable clothes, in what looked to be expensive fabrics, but his cravat was loosened and gave him a rakish, casual air. As she caught his eye, his smile widened slightly, and his gaze seemed to take her all in. Feeling herself flush, she hastily turned away and made her way down the steps. It must be Mr. Darcy's brother, she supposed, or one of them. She didn't know whether he had more than one. She was dismayed with the fact that he undoubtedly knew what was happening to Mr. Darcy, yet she could not ask him, and she wanted to stamp her foot in frustration. Excuse me, burp, burp, burp. As she hurried along the road, determined to return the next day, another young woman bumped into her coming the other way. Right, now this is the servant, but... yeah, this is... just make sure. Yes, she is the servant, so she's going to be the standard sort of Molly. Is this actually Molly? I think this is Molly. Yes, okay, so where are we? There. Another young woman bumped into her coming the other way. Madam, don't look at me. Go round the corner and I will follow and tell you where to find Miss Darcy. The girl hurried off. Elizabeth hesitated only an instant. As she hurried round the corner, she risked a glance back. The girl was across the road now and had doubled back. Elizabeth wondered what it was all about. The girl wore a servant dress, not wore a servant dress. Elizabeth wondered what it was all about. The girl wore servant dress, and perhaps it wouldn't be sensible to wait for her. But she had to know what had happened to Mr. Darcy. She stopped round the corner in the shadow of the great house. The girl panted up to her and curtsied. Panted up to her. The girl panted up to her and curtsied. I am sorry, madam, but I couldn't help hearing what you said to Mr. Jones. She must have seen Elizabeth's. She must have seen Elizabeth's blank look. The butler, he will never tell you anything. And then I saw young Mr. George looking at you. She shook her head. It would be better if you did not return. Elizabeth's chin went up. But I want to see Miss Darcy, she said reasonably, so I must return until I can. No. The girl looked round. It would be better if you call upon her at Matlock House. She is staying there at present with her aunt. Elizabeth frowned slightly. Is that far? If Miss Darcy wasn't going to be at Darcy House, Mish. If Miss Darcy wasn't going to be at Darcy House, she must find out where she was. Oh, no, less than half a mile. The girl pointed. In Grosvenor Square. You cannot miss it. It takes up a whole side of the square. Thank you, Elizabeth said quietly. Matlock House, you said? Yes, ma'am. Ma'am. Elizabeth said quietly. Matlock House, you said? Yes, ma'am. The girl bobbed another curtsy. I must go or I will get into trouble. She vanished into the shadows at the back of the house. Elizabeth stood, staring after her. Was she to blah 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 blah? Was she to be believed? She thought so. Ought she to go now to Matlock House, since it was so close? No, time was passing, and she must be home before dusk. Matlock House, Grosvenor Square. She fixed the directions in her mind and turned towards Cheapside. Perhaps she could have asked the servant about Mr. Darcy. Then she thought she might be the subject of gossip, and it was as well that she hadn't. She speeded up a little. It was a long way home. Perhaps she would manage to get out in the morning tomorrow. She would have to think of a better opening than she had used today, or she wouldn't be permitted to call on Miss Darcy. Then she might not find out how Mr. Darcy fared. Rum-pum-pum. Right. Save him off again. Get ready for a new chapter. Chapter 17. Georgiana sat on the sofa, twisting her hands together, her eyes full of tears. Next to her, Aunt Alice was reassuring. Next to her, Aunt Alice was a reassuring figure. Darcy knew he did not understand ladies' emotions, and hoped he would not distress his sister. He forced his face to remain impassive while he sat forward. He forced his face to remain impassive while he sat forward. He extended his hand towards her. Bring a chair and come closer to me, Georgiana. Calling here was supposed to make you feel better, not more anxious. He smiled as best he could. Georgiana looked at his face, and then she jumped to her feet and came towards him, sinking onto her knees beside his chair and resting her head on his knee. Oh, William, I have been so worried, and when the newspapers said you had been mortally wounded and were not expected to live the night, I could not bear it. Darcy was horrified. He patted her back gingerly. Come, Georgiana, since when could anybody believe anyone? Come, Georgiana, since when could anyone believe anything that was written in the papers? He made what he hoped were soothing noises and met Richard's gaze over her bent head. Look, you can see for yourself I am here and recovering very well. She stopped, sobbing, and looked up. But you are so pale, William, and your arm obviously hurts you. If it has taken this long to look as you do, you must have been really badly wounded, and then you will have to... and then you will have to... And then you will have to go back to the war, and I will really lose you. She burst into tears again and buried her face in her hands. He patted her shoulder, not knowing what else to do. Perhaps she ought to be permitted to cry it out. He glanced at his aunt. She ought to know. Okay, this is Lady Matlock. Just double check. Lady Matlock. Truly is, yeah, yes. That's fine. George, oh, hello, stamping on my cues. I hate it when it does that. There we go. Get rid of that. What's up in there? Georgiana, Aunt Alice spoke firmly. If you want to sit beside your brother, you may do so, but you must get a chair and behave in a more ladylike manner. You are embarrassing him. He felt his sister hesitate and rested his hand on her back. You could never embarrass me, dear Georgiana, but perhaps you had better get a chair, as Aunt Alice says. When Georgiana had composed herself a little, he smiled at her. Perhaps you could ring the bell for me and order more tea. Ladies always felt better with more tea, he knew that. His aunt looked approvingly at him. I, too, am glad to see more like... Glad to see you. I, too, am glad to see you more like yourself than I had dreaded, Darcy, she said crisply. He smiled tightly at her. She could be crisper than that. I, too, am glad to see you more like yourself than I had dreaded. I, too, am glad to see you more like yourself than I had dreaded, Darcy, she said crisply. He smiled tightly at her and turned back to his sister. It was remiss of me to worry you so much, Georgiana. Until I am quite well again, you will have to keep a very close eye on me to make sure I behave myself. He pasted a reassuring smile on his features, ignoring the muffled chuckle from Richard. His sister looked downcast. But what about the people? What about them? Darcy was puzzled. Well, everyone is saying how the crowd set upon you when you were wounded because they were angry that you had apprehended the man who tried to shoot the prince. She sounded almost beside herself with fear. When they recognize you now, you will never be safe. He reached for her hand. Please don't worry about things that haven't happened, Georgiana. I am quite safe here. Then I have time before I must return to duty. Not many people know what I look like, and one officer looks like... Not many people know what I look like, and one officer looks very like another when in uniform. He squeezed her hand. So I will be well disguised. Aunt Alice broke in. Darcy is right, Georgiana, and it is the duty of a lady to bear her anxieties without discomposing the gentleman. Now come and sit next to me again, and we will make ordinary conversation over tea before taking our leave. Darcy felt Georgiana hesitate and patted her hand again. And then you might call upon me again tomorrow, dear sister, if Aunt can escort you here. Certainly. Aunt Alice looked at Richard. You will be able to come and escort us, I presume? Richard smiled. I will indeed. I have a warrant from the prince saying that I am to make myself available for Darcy until he is recovered. He chuckled. I intend for your... Come on. Come on, Fitz. That's probably what threw me off. He's not quite right. I'll take it from Richard Smart. Richard, stamping all over my cues. Let's chop it there. Richard smiled. There we go. Richard smiled. I will indeed. I have a warrant from the prince saying that I am to make myself available for Darcy until he is recovered. He chuckled. I intend for your recovery to be prolonged, Darcy. 2 hours later, he sat in the small club room. This time Bingley had called on him in answer to his note. He sat forward on the edge of his chair. I am very glad to see you. No, it's Bingley. I am very glad to see you, and far more recovered than I dared hope. Darcy didn't feel recovered. The visit from his sister had exhausted him, and despite having rested, he knew he was not going to be able to complete this call as he wished. I am happy to see you, Bingley. Thank you for coming to London. I know you must have found it difficult to leave Netherfield when you did. Darcy sensed Richard's sharpened interest when he said it, and was amused. How much more would Richard be intrigued if he knew Darcy's feelings about Miss Elizabeth Bennet? Indeed, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, so it's a contrast. We've got to pick that up there. How much more would Richard be intrigued if he knew Darcy's feelings about Miss Elizabeth Bennet? Indeed, still, Bingley beamed. I was glad to be able to explain to Miss Bennet why I was coming to London, and thus why I would not be able to call on her for a few weeks. He looked pensive. I know we will both be glad when I can return. He looked up. But it is not important, Darcy. We have much business to talk about. He shook his head. I am sorry. I must remember to address you as my lord. He smiled wryly. You must call me out on it whenever I forget. Certainly not. Darcy was dismayed. I would very much prefer it if it was forgotten about, but if it cannot be, then when we are together as we are now, I would prefer Darcy, as always. Very well. Bingley knew his temper and changed the subject. Mr. Chatterton has been following the news. He has waited to finalise the agreement, but is increasingly anxious that you recover quickly to move the sum agreed. Darcy nodded. It was a very inconvenient time to be injured. He pushed himself to his feet and crossed to the small writing desk. I will write a note to the lawyer and the bank, authorising you to act on my behalf, Bingley. We must get the agreement settled quickly and the land purchase under way. He settled himself at the desk. As it is, it will be several years before all the buildings are completely ready. He paused, thinking, and looked up. When I can travel with you, we need to go north and see for ourselves how to arrange the completion of the promenade. Bingley nodded. I was thinking that when the agreement is finalised, I could go there and report back to you until you are well enough. I will commission some sketches for you to pronounce upon. Good. Darcy turned and began to write his notes. Did you have a chance to discuss the business with Colonel Fitzwilliam? Bingley sounded hesitant. Darcy nodded. Yes, I know the funds are not yet available. You must arrange for them to be guaranteed from my account for now. He ignored Bingley's knowing smile and concentrated on dripping the wax to seal his letters. After pressing the heavy Horse Guards seal on them, he handed them to Bingley. These will give you the authority to access the necessary funds, Bingley. You must convince Mr. Chatterton of our Chatterton. You must convince Mr. Chatterton of our trustworthiness. Yours, you mean? Bingley thrust the letters deep into his inner waistcoat pocket. I am fortunate to be able to partner with you. Your integrity and honour makes you the ideal. Was that waistcoat right? No, it's waistcoat. It should be waistcoat. Bingley thrust the letters deep into his inner waistcoat pocket. I am fortunate to be able to partner with you. Your integrity and honour make you the Ideal. Make you the ideal. Make you the ideal. Make you the ideal. Your integrity and honour make you the ideal investor for businessmen. He rose to his feet. Well, I will be away. You look quite exhausted enough for one day. Perhaps you will allow yourself to rest. He nodded at Richard. It will be a good business, Colonel. You will be pleased with it, I think. At the door, he turned slightly. Oh, yes. When I managed to inform Miss Bennet why I was coming to London, she was with her sister, who seemed dismayed to hear that it was you who had been injured. The newspapers had not printed your name, so she did not know it was you. He gave a sly smile and was gone, followed by Richard, who would escort him to the gate. Darcy muttered. Now Richard would ask stupid questions. But his heart felt warm. Miss Elizabeth Bennet knew of his injury. She had seemed dismayed. He wondered when he would see her again. But he scowled. Bingley ought not to have made that remark, and he knew it, or he would not have waited until leaving the room to do so. He reached for the decanter. He needed a drink. But he didn't have time to put the stopper down before Richard was back. "You cannot drink alone, Darcy. Let me join you." His jovial voice from the door drew Darcy. Ooh, there's a lot of D's there. His jovial voice from the door drew Darcy's reluctant smile. "Very well, Richard. Another will not hurt me." His cousin poured the whisky for them both. Darcy knew his knowing smile presaged? Presaged. I think it's presaged. But we need to check it. Presage, yeah. His cousin poured the whisky for both. Darcy knew his knowing smile presaged a comment. He did not comment. His cousin poured the whisky for them both. Darcy knew his knowing smile presaged a comment he did not want to hear. "Bingley says the younger Miss Bennet is quite pretty too." Richard gave him a sidelong glance. "He told me you danced with her and..." "He told me you danced with her and..." Come on, Richard, use your words. "He told me you danced with her and danced with her at an assembly, danced with her at an assembly." Yeah, okay. "He told me you danced with her at an assembly before you even danced with Miss Bingley. Twice." Darcy scowled. "I had a wager with Bingley that I could act more sociably if I wished to. That is all it was." That was weird. We can do better than that. Darcy scowled. Twice. Darcy scowled. "I had a wager with Bingley that I could act more sociably if I wished to, not if I wanted." "I had a wager with Bingley that I could act more sociably if I wished to. That is all it was." Richard seemed to be trying not to laugh. He dropped into the chair opposite Darcy. "And did it work?" "It has obviously fooled both of you," Darcy grumbled. "I will not do it again if I have this response." Richard's eyebrows rose. "Bingley is under the impression that you quite enjoyed yourself." Darcy looked incredulously at him. "No. That assembly was the one interrupted by Father's letter summoning me to London when we found out about how George came to be the heir." "Ah." There was a silence. Then Richard changed the subject. "I am surprised you appear to have given Bingley unfettered access to funds to invest." Itchy shoulder. Darcy stared at him unblinkingly. "There are two people I trust absolutely. Bingley is one of them. And you will have to forgive me, Richard. While you are the other man I trust, your business acumen is not on a level with Bingley's." Richard's shout of laughter made him wince. Very well. I will take charge of your non-business affairs, Darcy. Having told me you trust me, you cannot therefore refuse to follow my advice. He tipped his glass and hastily drank the rest of the whisky. After lunch, I will go to Matlock House and see that Georgiana is well following her call here. I advise you to go to your chamber and rest. News of your ennoblement is travelling fast, and you will have callers enough to exhaust you. They will all want your patronage. God damn it, patronage, man. They will all want your patronage to gain favour with the prince. Thank you, Richard. You are very helpful. Darcy knew his sarcasm would wash off his cousin's back, and he was not surprised by the laugh in response. Perhaps I ought to have a tray sent up to my chamber rather than brave the dining room. Richard chuckled. It is a good idea, Darcy. He got to his feet. I will lunch with Georgiana in that case. It's another chapter in the bag. Chapter 17. Save. Okay. Chapter 18. Elizabeth stared up at the imposing house. She had already walked round the square several times, trying to summon up the courage to knock at the door. Yesterday afternoon she had looked up the occupants of Matlock House in Who's Who in her uncle's library. Suitably dashed at the thought of trying to speak to Miss Darcy in the presence of a countess, she'd almost given up on her task. Yet here she was. She had to know what was happening. There was nothing in the news, and there seemed to be no way of finding anything out from Mr. Bingley. Encouraging Jane to call on Miss Bingley with her had been thwarted because that lady had remained in Hertfordshire, which Elizabeth had not expected. It was almost Christmas, and she would have to return to Longbourn with her aunt and uncle. She must know. Before she lost courage again, she stepped up to the great door, and the doorbell jangled loudly. She took a deep breath. Right now, I don't think have we got a Matlock butler already? Butler. Have we got? I don't think we do. No, we don't. Okay. Have I got anything in my notes? Not yet. No. Okay, so tall, ornately dressed, powdered wig. So. Jangled loudly. She took a deep breath. Good afternoon. A very tall, ornately dressed butler in a powdered wig stood waiting for her to say something. Elizabeth raised her chin. Miss Elizabeth Bennet to call on Miss Darcy. I have been sent from Darcy House. She stepped forward as if expecting to be in... She stepped forward as if expecting to be invited in. Wait here, madam. Right. Just make sure they were both the same. Miss Elizabeth Bennet to call on Miss Darcy. Good afternoon. Wait here, madam. Perfect. So let's just grab him. Boom. Butler at Matlock House. Gotcha. The butler indicated to her the exact spot on the floor where she was to wait, and she looked round her with interest. She was not likely to return. Several footmen stood around the hall as if waiting for instructions, and the butler knocked on the gilded double doors and entered what seemed to be a drawing-room beyond. It was a long time. Elizabeth comforted herself with the knowledge that at least... Elizabeth comforted herself with the knowledge that at least Miss Darcy was at home, and there was no sign of mourning, so Mr. Darcy must be all right. She hoped he was feeling better. Then the butler was entering the hall from another doorway. "Do you have a visiting card, madam?" Elizabeth shook her head. "No, I do not." She had wondered whether to write her name on one of her aunts, but had decided against it. Perhaps curiosity would gain her entry to his sister. "Follow me, please." The butler opened the door of a smaller chamber and announced her. "Miss Elizabeth Bennet." She smiled. It sounded quite imposing for a country miss. It seemed Miss Darcy was curious about her. She drew a deep breath and swept into the room. She saw a young woman about her own height, with hair as fair as Jane's, combed back elegantly. Elizabeth curtsied politely. "Thank you for Thank you for lower. Thank you for permitting me to call upon you, Miss Darcy." The girl curtsied back. "I am sorry we have to use the music room, but my aunt is entertaining in the drawing-room." Heavens! Elizabeth was very glad she had not been ushered into a room full of aristocratic ladies taking tea. "I am sorry to have interrupted you when you were entertaining." "It does not matter." The girl remained standing. "I admit I am curious as to why you have called on me." She cast an anxious glance towards the window. Elizabeth followed her gaze and saw a tall, handsome man in a gaudy officer's dress uniform leaning by the frame. He looked watchful and a little suspicious. "Oh, I am sorry. This is my cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam." Elizabeth curtsied at his perfunctory bow and turned her attention back to the girl. She was much younger than she had thought she would be, and she suddenly recalled that Mr. Darcy had said at the assembly that his sister was more than 10 years his junior. But Elizabeth had forgotten. She set herself to reassure her. "I do—" Yeah, no, that's right. "I do not wish to keep you from knowing my business, Miss Darcy, but I happen to have come to town recently, and I am wondering—" Let's do that whole thing again. "I do not wish to keep you from knowing my business, Miss Darcy, but I happen to have come to town recently, and I am wondering how your brother is faring since his injury." There, she had said it. Now she must be careful not to cause him any embarrassment should he get to hear of it. "Oh, I did not know you were acquainted with him." Miss Darcy sounded quite animated. "Come and sit down. We will take tea." She nodded at a footman. This was much better than Elizabeth could have hoped for, and she followed Miss Darcy to the chairs by the fire, glad they weren't too close to the aloof officer. "I was able to call on my brother for the first time this morning." The girl seemed happy to talk. "While he was at Carlton House, no one was allowed in because the prince was concerned for his own security. Only my cousin could go because everyone thought he worked there." She smiled. "Only my cousin could go because everyone thought he worked there." She smiled over at the man by the window, then looked at Elizabeth. "So I heard the news, but it was so bad at first I was very anxious. But today he seemed better than I could ever have hoped." Elizabeth felt the tight knot inside her ease slightly. This was worth all the anxiety of anxiety. This was worth all the anxiety of coming here and the risk of being rejected. "Thank you for telling me. It must be such a relief to you. So you're saying he is not at Carlton House any longer?" "No, he—" Georgiana. Georgiana. The officer spoke up warningly, and the girl bit her lip. "I am sorry. Perhaps I ought not to have said." Elizabeth had to reassure her. "No, I am sorry. I should not have asked you. It was very kind of you to tell me what you have." She cast around for something to say. This is a beautiful room, and a wonderful instrument. The grand pianoforte had pride of place in the centre of the room, and she longed to hear what it sounded like. "Do you play, Miss Darcy?" It was a silly question, really. All young ladies seemed to be accomplished musicians. "Oh, yes." The girl cheered up. "I prefer the pianoforte to the harp, I think, but I love all forms of music." Elizabeth... That was a bit too high. She's... Yeah. "Oh, yes." The girl cheered up. "I prefer the pianoforte to the harp, I think, but I love all forms of music." Elizabeth kept the topics on matters of light conversation. Why do I say conversation sometimes? I wonder. I really wonder. It's just weird. Elizabeth kept the topics on matters of light conversation, not mentioning Mr. Darcy again, and she felt the suspicion from the officer seemed to recede a little. Finally, she put down her cup. "Thank you again for agreeing to see me, Miss Darcy. It has been a great pleasure, and I hope you have not missed too much opportunity to entertain." "And I hope you have not missed too much opportunity to entertain your aunt's friends." "Oh, no, I've enjoyed it." The girl looked wistful. "It would be nice to have a friend. Perhaps you could call again?" Elizabeth shook her head. "I think you ought to discuss the matter with your family first, Miss Darcy, before extending me an invitation. I would not wish to cause you any trouble." She rose to her feet. "It has been delightful. Thank you." They curtsied, and Elizabeth left the room, not looking at Colonel Fitzwilliam. Why couldn't he have left them alone? She walked back to Cheapside by the riverside route, glad that it would take her an hour. She would have time to ponder on what she had learned. She was happy to have found out that he was greatly improved. Not only that, he was well enough to have been moved from Carlton House. He wouldn't be at Darcy House, she supposed, or Miss Darcy would not be staying with her aunt. Perhaps he was in the army quarters to get attention from the doctors there. Need a sip. Miss Darcy was a pleasant young lady. She was very shy, of course, and Elizabeth was glad of it, or she might not have been so forthcoming. It would be good to be friends with her, but Elizabeth knew she must not encourage it. What would Mr. Darcy think if he found What would Mr. Darcy think if he found she had encouraged a friendship? He would think she had designs on him. When she was... she needs to be... that's a bit more shocking. And what's going on there? Is that... Just check that. There we go. That's... He would think she had designs on him. When she was halfway home, she turned her mind to think what to say to Jane and her aunt. She couldn't lie to them, but she could hardly admit to what she had done. But as she climbed the But as she climbed the... Dear me, come on, hold on. Are you all coming? Ugh. But as she climbed the steps of number 23 Gracechurch Street, Jane pulled the door open and ran down to her. "Lizzie, you will never guess what has happened." Elizabeth... There's a big burp, and I need to go and look at that. Just... Yeah, I started at the wrong point. Yeah. "Lizzie, you will never guess what has happened." Elizabeth stared at her. "What is it?" Her sister seemed bright-eyed and excited, but her gaze didn't show that softness she exhibited when they talked about Mr. Bingley. He couldn't have come here. He didn't know they were in town. "Come in. Let me show you." Jane tugged her in the door, waited impatiently while Elizabeth took off her coat and hat, and they hurried into the drawing-room together. "So, tell me what it is." "Uncle Gardiner brought this home with him today." Jane flattened out a periodical on the table. Elizabeth frowned. What is it? I don't recognise it. Well, we don't know anyone who gets it, of course, Jane said, leafing. That's shouldn't leave it. Jane said, leafing through the pages. And it is only published quarterly, so I don't expect you've seen it. She looked up and saw her sister's expression. It's the London Gazette, Lizzie. An officer was visiting. She looked up and saw her sister's expression. It's the London Gazette, Lizzie. An officer was visiting the warehouse today with his lady, and they were talking to Uncle about the attempted assassination of Prinny, and then he mentioned about Mr. Darcy having been moved from Carlton House, and said, Look. She pointed towards an entry on the closely printed sheet. Elizabeth bent forward and screwed up her eyes to read. Darcy Fitzwilliam, created Earl of Falmouth. Her heart nearly stopped. Miss Darcy's cousin must have known of it. He would think she knew, would think she was pursuing his cousin, coveting a title and wealth. She sank into a chair and covered her eyes. File, save all projects, and on we go. Chapter 19. Darcy slumped into the Right, come on. Chapter 19. Darcy slumped into the leather library chair in the small mess room and shivered. The servant hurried towards him. Do you wish me to build up the fire, my lord? Darcy nodded. I would be grateful, thank you. He hoped no other officer would come in. He was not inclined to be sociable, but he had to. But he had to leave his chamber, or he would not sleep tonight. He had taken lunch up there and slept heavily all afternoon, surprising himself. Then the regimental surgeon had arrived, together with Mr. Barry from... come on. Then the regimental surgeon had arrived, together with Mr. Barry from Carlton House. Together they had redressed his wound, discussing between them what treatment they'd do, and seeming to forget Darcy was there. Finally, he had snapped at them. I do not care what you do, but for goodness sake, tell me what you are about and how soon I will be able to move freely again. They had exchanged glances, and Mr. Barry had shaken his head. This whole thing will take time, my lord. I think the best thing for you will be to leave London and go to the country if you have somewhere you can stay. There you might be busy enough to forget your temper. Shooting and other sports will mean you need to move, yet not take part in riskier pastimes. Netherfield. He could go to Netherfield with Bingley. If Richard really had a warrant to assist him, he could come too, and Miss Elizabeth Bennet would be there. She would need to accompany her sister when she was asked to call at Netherfield. He would see her. So, when the surgeons had gone, he had come downstairs. He would dine down here and hope to be tired enough to sleep. His wound was paining him after it had been redressed, and he would need a few drinks to dull it. After the servant had stoked the fire and left the room, Darcy sat with a whisky in his hand and stared at the fire. He needed to decide what to do about Miss Elizabeth Bennet. He seemed to have been thinking about her for a long time. When he thought back, though, he discovered, to his surprise, that he'd only met her on 2 occasions. Was it 2 or 3? He thought back, frowning. He had danced with her at the assembly, of course. He smiled slightly. He had even had a second dance with her, well, part of one. He was impressed that she was more anxious than he that he read such an urgent letter. Then he had called on her at Longbourn with Bingley after his return to the country. He had been deep in thought, and he'd had to apologise for his taciturnity. Is that right? Taciturn. Yeah, taciturnity. But that needs to be more fluid. He had been deep in thought, and he'd had to apologize for his taciturnity. He felt comfortable with her, he knew that. She had accepted, not accepted. She had accepted he had a lot to think about, and she had not been offended, but that call hadn't ended well. He frowned. He didn't know what had gone amiss, but she'd been rather distant, and he'd wondered what he'd done wrong. He tried to puzzle it out, but he still couldn't imagine what had happened. "Goodness me, Darcy, have you received orders to the front, or something equally as alarming?" Richard's voice boomed out as he banged into the room. Darcy winced. "Not so loud, if you please, Richard. I have had the surgeons attacking me this afternoon, and I am extremely uncomfortable." Richard prized the glass out of his hand. "Perhaps you need another drink, cousin. Then you will feel better." He turned to the decanter. "I must say, if Georgiana could see you now, she would not be as cheerful about your state of health as she currently is." "Well, she has not seen me now," Darcy muttered. Then he felt ashamed of his behaviour. "I am sorry, Richard. How is she? Was she pleased for your company?" "Indeed she was." Richard stood over him and handed him his glass. "But I have some news for you, so you had better drink that and listen to me." There was a strange expression in his eyes, and Darcy wondered gloomily what else in his life could go spectacularly wrong. "Is it something about George?" "George?" Richard sounded bemused. "No, it is not George. I have nothing to say about him. No, it is something that happened at Matlock House this afternoon." He sank happily into the seat opposite Darcy and glanced at the door to make sure it was closed. "I lunched with the ladies, as I said I would. Georgiana is definitely more cheerful than before she had seen you, and is hopeful about your recovery. Then, in the afternoon, Mother wanted us to be with her for one of her philanthropic tea parties." He groaned. "You know how they go." Darcy nodded. He took pains to avoid such occasions when he could. "I sympathise with your plight, Richard, but you still have not told me the news which is causing such a strange glint in your eye." Richard leaned forward. "I was deep in conversation with Lady Pamela, Mrs. Palmer, and Miss Abigail Holding when the butler came to the door. I excused myself and joined Mother. Georgiana was sitting near her as well." Darcy stared at his cousin, who appeared to be enjoying himself. "It seemed that a young lady had arrived at the door to call upon Georgiana. The butler was not familiar with her name." "The butler was not familiar with her name, and neither was my mother or Georgiana. In fact, up until this morning I had never heard the name either." He smiled knowingly. "Mother was inclined to tell him to dismiss the young lady, and Georgiana looked rather nervous. But since I had heard the name this morning, I suggested that I could be present during the call to support Georgiana, and we would find out what she wanted." Darcy leaned back and closed his eyes. How could this be of interest to him? Richard was taking far too long to get to the point. But his cousin didn't seem daunted in the slightest by Darcy's apparent disinterest. "I think Mother thought the same as I would have before I heard the name, that the young lady had heard about your ennoblement and was intending to befriend Georgiana with the hope that she might meet you." He chuckled. "I got her to agree that we would take her call in the music room. I was intrigued because the only time I had heard the name before was when your friend Bingley mentioned a Miss Bennet this morning, and the expression on your face was illuminating." Darcy found himself on his feet without any recollection of getting there. "What? Her name was Miss Bennet. Which Miss Bennet was she? Why is she in town? Was she all right?" And "Her name was Miss Bennet. Which Miss Bennet was she? Why is she in town? Was she all right? And how did she know where to find Georgiana?" Richard seemed excessively amused at Darcy's reaction, and Darcy scowled, turning away. He stood by the window and stared out at the darkening night. She was here, in London, and he hadn't known. How soon might he call on her? He smiled grimly. Now he had something to work for. "She was Miss Elizabeth Bennet, I understand." Richard's voice was level. "A very pretty, dark-haired young lady, with excellent manners, but an obvious determination to do whatever was needed to find out what she wanted. No other would have dared to call upon a young lady she did not know, staying with relations who were titled." Darcy was able to smile wryly as he was facing away from Richard. It was exactly what Miss Elizabeth Bennet would do. Why had she done it? What did she want to know? He waited impatiently for Richard to continue, but the silence drew out, and eventually he turned. "Continue, man. Continue, man. You have had your amusement at my expense. Now you must answer my questions." Excuse me. "Sit down, then. You are still very pale when you're standing, and I don't want you forgetting what I tell you." "I am not that addled," Darcy grumbled, but his cousin was waiting, so he returned to his chair, muttering. "As I said, she apologized for interrupting Georgiana's afternoon and said that she happened to find herself in town and wondered how her brother was faring after his injury." Darcy felt warm inside again, just as he did when she had laughed. "So what transpired then?" "So what transpired then?" He tried hard to appear relatively disinterested, but if Bingley had said he danced with her twice, he would not get away with it, he knew. Strangely, it did not bother him as much as he thought it ought to. Richard shrugged. "Not very much. She looked very relieved when Georgiana said how much better you appeared today, but then Georgiana seemed inclined to give a little too much information that would seem wise to a young lady we supposedly knew nothing of. When I prevented it, Miss Bennet turned the subject to music and had a nice, genteel conversation about music, so much so that when she got up to go, Georgiana said it would be nice to have a friend and perhaps she could call again." Darcy was astounded. Darcy was astounded, his shy little sister being as brave as that. But then he knew Miss Elizabeth was a kind and astute person. She would be an ideal friend for Georgiana. "Perhaps I can happen to be there next time she calls on Georgiana." He felt hopeful. He might be able to see her without the dread of a long journey to Hertfordshire. But Richard shook his head. "No, Miss Bennet said to her that she ought to discuss it with her family first, and that she would not wish to cause Georgiana any trouble. Then she went. So where is she staying? Of course Georgiana can extend her an invitation." For the first time, Richard looked. For the first time, Richard looked. For the first time, Richard looked chagrined. "I don't know, Darcy. I'm sorry, but I assumed she'd left a card with the butler. However, when I asked, she'd apparently said she didn't have one. We don't know where she is staying." Darcy stared at him in consternation. "London is a big place, Richard." "Yes." His cousin was looking at him. His cousin was looking at him steadily. "I am sorry. It is obviously more important to you than I had realized." Darcy glared into the flames. How could they find out where she was? "An aunt. She talked about an aunt who lived in London. Perhaps she is staying with them." Shit, no, that's Darcy. Let's stomp to my own cue. Got away with it, though. It's come in there. "An aunt. She talked about an aunt who lived in London. Perhaps she is staying with them." "But their name might not be Bennet," Richard argued. "True, but it is our only hope at present." Richard was thinking hard. "Perhaps Georgiana could write to her in Hertfordshire, asking her to call. Then it would be forwarded on to London." Darcy shook his head. "And how is Georgiana And how is Georgiana supposed to find out where Miss Bennet lives in Hertfordshire? Oh. There was a lengthy silence. A knock at the door heralded. A knock at the door heralded a servant. Mr. Bingley asking if it is convenient to call, my lord. Richard's slow smile must have echoed Darcy's. Very convenient, thank you. Colonel Fitzwilliam will come and verify who he is for you. Okay. Chapter 18, 19. Save him off. Okay, let's take a second. If anyone is interested, I'm a one ear on, one ear off, one can on, I've got a can on there, and I've got nothing on there, but I do have in there an ear defender thing. It's a wax thing. It just means that I can hear my voice in my head, like when you do if you're singing and you can't hear your own voice, you stick a finger in one ear or both ear, and you can hear your voice more in your head because you can hear the resonances in your own head. And that just helps me to hear myself and not have to have two cans on and turn the volume up, because I've got a certain amount of hearing damage from jumping up and down in nightclubs right by the speaker stacks in my 20s, which means obviously I'm going a bit deaf. Not far off nearing hearing aids, apparently, but not quite there yet. I'm sure that will come in the fullness of time. I shall join my father with the robotic earpieces. Until then, we continue with chapter 20. Okay, off we go. Chapter 20. Elizabeth knew she was quiet and pale at breakfast the next morning, but she must make an effort to act normally. Aunt Gardiner knew her very well and was quite plainly inclined to want to find out what had distressed Elizabeth quite so much the previous day. Uncle Gardiner was ebullient, not as ebullient. Uncle Gardiner was ebullient. Uncle Gardiner was ebullient. It feels like there should be an as, but there isn't. It's just me adding it. Hold on, small burp. That's better. Post-lunch burps. Uncle, there's something wrong about that punch as well. There it is. Small breath there. Get rid of that. Uncle Gardiner was ebullient as ever as they breakfasted, but soon he pushed back his chair. Well, I must be away to my business and leave you ladies to entertain yourselves. He glanced at Elizabeth. I think you might wish to walk in the park, Lizzie. Get some colour in your cheeks. He bent to kiss his wife's forehead. At least it is not many days now until we go into the country. Yes, Uncle. This is Jane. Yes, Uncle Gardiner, I think it is a good idea, and I'll walk with Lizzie. Jane was watching her too. Elizabeth felt dismal, but she couldn't tell them what it was. But she couldn't tell them what it was all about. She was far too mortified. Aunt Gardiner called for the small chaise that morning and accompanied them to Regent's Park with the children and nursemaids. Elizabeth wished she hadn't chosen it. It was far too close to Grosvenor Square, and she was in an agony of anxiety that Miss Darcy and her relations might choose to walk there. Lizzie. Aunt Gardiner strolled with her, while Jane stayed with the children. I had hoped we were close enough that you trusted me and felt you could confide in me. I'm sorry you're unhappy this morning. Elizabeth made a face at the ground in front of her. I'm sorry, Aunt. I hate to make you sad. She couldn't tell her, couldn't say what had happened that had embarrassed her so much. What on earth would Mr. Darcy think when she... What on earth would Mr. Darcy think when he discovered she had called uninvited on his sister so soon after his ennoblement? His cousin had been suspicious of her, she could tell it. He would tell Mr. Darcy what had happened, and her face burned as she thought of it. But he was a second son. He knew, as she did, that he must marry a lady of fortune. Now he must do so soon, for it might be that he could no longer earn a living in the army if his wounds were such as to render him unfit for service. Unfit? Now he must do so soon, for it might be that he could no longer earn a living in the army if his wounds were such as to render him unfit for service. She wondered if any lady of fortune would look at him with favour. It might be that his injuries were such as would be unsightly. She gave the ghost of a smile. She wouldn't mind. Then she shook herself. It would not do to dwell on what had happened. She would never see him again, and there was nothing she could do about it. At least she had left no indication of where she would At least she had left no indication of where she was staying. He could not find her, and that was for the best. She had met him briefly, only twice. She could not have such feelings for him as she imagined she did. She straightened up. She was 20 years old, much too old to be moping about, thinking of love in every handsome face. No, she would return to her plans of earning secretly what she could and saving it. With Papa's help, she was amassing a few shillings, and when she finished her book, she would be able to pay for it to be printed. There must be other ways for a gentleman's daughter to earn money respectably, and she must research it and put her feelings aside. Good. Her aunt was watching her. I can see you have decided to turn your thoughts to happier things. She smiled. But remember, I am always able to listen, and I do not judge you. Judge? Nobody wants to judge you, love. And I do not judge you harshly. Elizabeth smiled and tucked her hand into her aunt's. Come on, diction. Elizabeth smiled and tucked her hand into her aunt's arm. I know, and I am so fortunate to have you with me, but I can do this and not discompose you. She turned to look at the children. I am sorry for Jane, though. Waiting must be hard for her, and I haven't been able to find a way of telling Mr. Bingley that we're in town. Well, from what you've said, it appears he will call on her when he's next in Hertfordshire, so we can hope all will be well. They turned. They turned to rejoin the rest of the party. But Elizabeth felt a new sense of embarrassment. If Jane and Mr. Bingley married, he would have his friend Mr. Darcy, Lord Falmouth, to stay with him often. She shivered, glad that her aunt was looking away from her, because she knew her face must be aflame with the embarrassing thought of Mr. Darcy looking at her with cold amusement, thinking she might have been pursuing him now he was an earl. In the afternoon, she and Jane were in their chambers, beginning to sort through their things, ready to pack them for the journey to Longbourn in 2 days' time. A maid came panting up the stairs. Miss Bennet and Miss Elizabeth, Mrs. Gardiner has asked that you join her for afternoon tea when convenient. So she's panting just because it's a long way up, not because she's panicking. Yeah, okay. Okay, let's go back over that. Miss Bennet and Miss Elizabeth, Mrs. Gardiner has asked that you join her for afternoon tea when convenient. Jane turned to her. Of course, we'll come down now. She looked at Elizabeth. Did you manage to tell Aunt about your distress last night? I'm sorry I showed you the Gazette. I'd no idea it would cause such an upset. It didn't, dear Jane, and I needed to know. Just imagine if he's staying with Mr. Bingley one day in the future and we address him incorrectly. It would be mortifying if we hadn't appeared to keep up with society. Oh, yes, you're right, as always. Jane squeezed her hands. I'm glad we came to London, but I can't say I'm sorry that we're going home. I feel the same. I'm just sorry I didn't manage to find a way to tell Mr. Bingley we were here." Elizabeth sighed. It was hard to find things out when ladylike behaviour decreed there was so much they couldn't do. They sat quietly over their needlework in the drawing-room. The children were upstairs with their governess, and Aunt Gardiner was asking them about the happenings in Hertfordshire, so she would be up to date with all the news. There was a sudden ring at the doorbell. Excuse me. Aunt Gardiner frowned. "It's not the time for calls, is it? I do hope your uncle is all right." The drawing-room door opened, and the housekeeper looked in. Have we already had a housekeeper in? There. I don't believe so, but we'll just make sure. They're all Misters, they're all Mrs. No, we haven't. So this is the housekeeper, so she will be somewhat more. Oh, let's go and pick her up there. Drawing-room door open, and the housekeeper looked in. "Mr. Bingley to call on Miss Bennet." The ladies rose to their feet, Jane with a becoming blush. Elizabeth kept her face expressionless. How had he found them? "You are very welcome, Mr. Bingley." Aunt Gardiner was her usual gracious self. "Do take a seat." And she indicated a chair opposite where Jane was sitting. He bowed extravagantly. "Thank you, Mrs. Gardiner, for permitting my call, even though it's not the prescribed time." "It is no matter." She nodded at him, and they all curtsied and sat down so he could take his seat. "We will take tea." There was a short silence. Then their aunt turned to her guest. "We're pleased to see you, Mr. Bingley, but I expect Jane is wondering how you discovered she is staying here." He smiled, a little anxiously, Elizabeth thought. "I called on Miss Bennet at Longbourn. Mrs. Bennet told me you had been staying here in London, and she gave me the direction." They all watched as the housekeeper supervised the maid, who set down the tray carefully. When they'd left the room, Aunt Gardiner started to pour the tea. "I imagine Mrs. Bennet informed you that this family and my helps if you breathe before the sentence. "I imagine Mrs. Bennet informed you that this family and my nieces are travelling to Longbourn on Thursday for Christmas?" Mr. Bingley looked slightly uncomfortable. "Yes, madam, she did. But I needed to return to London in any event, so she was happy to give me the direction here." "I see." Aunt handed him his cup. "Well, perhaps you will be able to give us news of Meryton." He nodded, his eyes straying to Jane again. She seemed to be glad of the cup in her hand to occupy herself. "I hope the reason for having to return to London is not that your friend is unwell again?" Elizabeth. Oh, it's Jane, sorry. "I hope the sugar, sugar, sugar. Right, okay, what's going on here? I can tighten that up a bit. "I hope the reason for having to return to London is not that your friend is unwell again." Elizabeth breathed a sigh of relief that Jane had asked what she... Wowzers, articulators. Elizabeth breathed a sigh of relief that Jane had asked what she couldn't. She needed to know what was happening, and she could never ask. "Oh, no, Darcy is quite well," Mr. Bingley said heartily. "I knew he was feeling much better when he started being his usual irascible self." He gave Elizabeth a knowing glance. Elizabeth bit her lip. She must not show more than a slight interest. The best thing of all was that Mr. Bingley had been in Hertfordshire. He would not know anything about her call on Miss Darcy, nor the mortification of finding out that Mr. Darcy would think her the worst kind of fortune-hunter. But she must not think of him that way. He wasn't Mr. Darcy, he was Lord Falmouth. Falmouth. But she must not think of him that way. He wasn't Mr. Darcy, he was Lord Falmouth. She shivered. At least she knew he was recovering. She couldn't imagine him being amenable to anything he didn't like if he was feeling well. Chapter 20. Hum, bum, bum. And a file and a save. Okay. Mini stretch. Oh, yeah. Oh. Oh, there we go. That's what I'm talking about. How long's this session gone so far? Let's have a look. Hour 40. Is that right? Hour 40? Hour 40, yeah. That's not too bad. I might need to break the session, though, in, I don't know, sometime. Maybe about the 2-hour mark, just because the old articulators are getting a bit tired. And that will probably infer a cup of tea and a bit of break and a little reset and stuff. But between now and then, one more chapter. Here we go. What were we, before we start, how much have we got in the bag today? That was 1:58 where we started, wasn't it? So, where are we? 1:58, so that's an hour and 5. Okay. Chapter 21. Darcy sat forward impatiently. So you have called there? What was it like? Did you see both the young ladies? Bingley settled himself in a chair. I did. They both appear well, and much as usual, although Miss Elizabeth seemed tired and pale. She didn't speak much. Darcy wondered what had happened. He could not imagine Miss Elizabeth not being ready with her wit and amusement to inject into any company. So, did they accept the story of how you located them? Richard was sitting lazily in the other library chair, his legs up on a footstool. Bingley smiled. Indeed, they seemed quite happy with the thought I had called at Longbourn and been redirected to Cheapside. I did not vouchsafe the fact that... I did not vouchsafe the fact I had ridden there at dawn this morning, so little to find it out. I did not vouchsafe the fact that I... Not fact that, fact I. I did not vouchsafe the fact I had ridden there at dawn this morning, so... This morning... I did not vouchsafe the fact I had ridden there at dawn this morning solely to find it out. He grimaced. I had the worst horse possible at the final post, Darcy. I will be very stiff tomorrow. Darcy tried to look sympathetic. Well, thank you for your efforts. He turned to his cousin. I am concerned that she seemed discomposed. Do you think anything happened following her call on Georgiana? Richard shrugged. I don't know. His expression sharpened, and he sat forward. What I do know is that you are far too concerned for her when she is someone you have barely met. He pointed his finger at him. I think you would do well to stay away until you are quite yourself again. He slumped back in the chair. You have been severely injured, and before that you didn't mention her. I think your injury has caused you to dwell on her, and you have magnified it in your mind to something of much more importance than it can really be. You must think carefully on the matter, Darcy. Georgiana will depend on any wife of yours being in society high enough to help with her coming out. And Cheapside. That place only confirms that she can be coming from nothing. You have told me before that you must marry a lady of fortune, so George never suspects you have obtained wealth in your own right. She must be unsuitable, and you've been so addled by blood loss that you cannot see it. Darcy was utterly taken aback by his cousin's vehemence. He glanced at Bingley, whose face was set. The insult would have been to Miss Jane Bennet as well, but he could not take it for Elizabeth either. You are wrong, Richard. His voice was low. I don't know if your father has put you up to this over lunch, but you are wrong. You told me yourself yesterday that she would make a very suitable friend for Georgiana, so how can you now say what you do? And if Bingley is likely to marry her elder sister... He looked at his friend. You are, yes? Bingley spluttered a little and flushed dark red. I'd like nothing better, you know that. Darcy turned back to Richard. "I trust you, Richard. I've told you I do, but you are wrong about this." He knew his smile was twisted. "Come with us tomorrow. We will call at Cheapside and see for ourselves what the place is like." Richard looked shocked. "But then she would know I had told you—" "Have told you." "But then she would know I have told you of her—" "But then she would know I have told you of her call on Georgiana." "It will serve you right for the insult you have just paid her," Darcy growled, "and you can keep the aunt in conversation while Bingley and I have the opportunity to talk to our respective ladies." "She is a very elegant lady," Bingley said, his embarrassment having turned to amusement, "and she has a gracious home." Richard threw up his hands in despair. "Well, if you are determined and know your feelings, then I will not stop you." He glanced sideways at Darcy. "Just take a few moments tonight to think about the matter. You are a Darcy, and you are a—" "You are a Darcy, and you are allied to the Fitzwilliams and the Matlock estate. Not only that, you are now an earl with all the attendant need to found the name as a great family." He looked hard at Darcy. "You are an honourable man. If you later think you have caused her to gain hopes of you, you would not withdraw merely because you had regrets." Darcy scowled. He knew Richard had his best interests. Darcy scowled. He knew Richard had his best in... come on. Darcy scowled. He knew Richard had his best interests. Best interests. I do need a break after this. Darcy scowled. He knew Richard had his best... Richard had his best interests. Darcy scowled. He knew Richard had his best interests at heart, and he hesitated. "Well, you are my No, sorry, that's Fitzwilliam. Here we go. I lost my mice." "Well, you are my cousin, and I must acknowledge that all you have said is true. So I will do as you say and think about the matter carefully." He sat up straighter. "But in the meantime, we will lay our plans to call there in the morning." He forced a smile. Plans. "But in the meantime, we will lay our plans to call there in the morning." He forced a smile at his cousin. "I recall you told me just last night that she was very pretty and with excellent manners." Richard looked discomfited. "So I did. Well, I will hope in the morning to learn a little more of what has entranced you so much." "Good." Darcy sat back. "Bingley, will you dine with us tonight?" "Gladly." Bingley smiled. He seemed to have forgiven Richard the insult to Miss Bennet, and Darcy was struck again how good a friend he was. But Bingley was still speaking. "You need to know, though, that the Gardiners and the Miss Bennets are travelling to Hertfordshire on Thursday for the Christmas period. The young ladies will obviously remain at home afterwards." Darcy rose to his feet, trying not to wince with the pain. "I suppose you will also be returning to Netherfield then?" At Bingley's nod, he smiled. "Good. Might you accept a guest? The surgeons have recommended I spend some time in the country. We can discuss it over dinner." Darcy leaned back in his chair while his servant shaved him. It was important to him that he look as he always had for this call on Miss Elizabeth. It was important to him that he look as he always had for this call on Miss Elizabeth Bennet this morning. A strange, unsettled feeling within him was worrying, and he hoped it didn't portend anything going wrong. He glanced at the closet door. A new dress uniform jacket hung there, resplendent. He just hoped he could get it on without opening the wound. Yesterday's attempt to get on working uniform had led to the wound opening by his elbow, the one area that hadn't yet... the one area that hadn't yet healed properly. He smiled, not he'd. He smiled wryly. He'd summoned the surgeon and with a few blistering words had told him he expected the new dressing not to show any sign of blood on his new uniform today. The man had pointed out to him the inadvisability of wearing an expensive uniform until the wound was completely healed, and Darcy had apologized for his earlier words. "I must wear it tomorrow. I have a call to make, and in the afternoon I need to call on the Regent." "If you go to that appointment in uniform, my lord, you will undoubtedly be If you go to that... No, because he's a doctor, isn't he? It's regiment. "If you go to that appointment in uniform, my lord, you will undoubtedly be recalled to active service much sooner than is wise." "Perhaps you are right." But Darcy knew he ought to call on Prinny. He dared not lose favour, whatever he might wish. "I have finished, my lord." His servant handed him the towel and began "I have finished, my lord." "I have..." I'm stamping on my cues again. Come in there and just tuck some of that away. There we go. "I have finished, my lord." His servant handed him the towel and began clearing the paraphernalia from the side table. That was just very awkward. "I have finished, my lord." His servant handed him the towel and began clearing the paraphernalia from the side table. "Thank you." Darcy leaned forward and wiped his face. Soon he would see Miss Elizabeth Bennet again. Would his feelings be the same? He had thought about Richard's words during a wakeful night. Surely his feelings were not merely because of the injury he'd suffered. No, he had been unable to banish her from his thoughts almost since the day he had met her. He desired her. He'd known that from the beginning, when he had impulsively asked her to dance. He was surprised he hadn't fought his desires more fiercely. He shrugged. As the second son, what did it matter if he married a country lady of little fortune? But Richard had put doubt in his mind. Not that he was going to recant his feelings, certainly not. It was just that he knew now what opposition within the family he might have to surmount. Soon enough, it was after breakfast, and he was in a bit too quick. Soon enough, it was after breakfast, and he was ensconced in Bingley's coast. Soon enough, it was after... Still too quick. Soon enough, it was after breakfast, and he was ensconced in Bingley's coach with his friend and Richard. His arm was sore today. The new dressing was too tight, and he'd had a difficult night. But he must push the discomfort aside. He'd discarded the sling the surgeon had advised him to use, although its lack made his arm ache abominably. Richard regarded him from the opposite seat. "I think it is a mistake, Darcy. You ought to wear the sling and look..." "I think it is a mistake, Darcy. You ought to wear the sling and look like a proper wounded hero." Darcy scowled. "I am not a hero, and guarding Prinny is not looked upon with admiration by most of the population." "True." Richard seemed to be deep in thought. "But the young lady knows what your duty was, and she still called on Georgiana." "Yes. It seems an extraordinarily... No, that's Bingley. Bradford. It seems an extraordinarily courageous thing to have done. Don't you agree, Darcy?" Bingley joined the conversation. Darcy smiled thinly. "I always thought she was an independently minded young lady. But I agree, it was certainly not the sort of thing most ladies would... But I agree, it was certainly not the sort of thing most ladies would have dared to do." A thought struck him, and he turned to his cousin. "How did she know Georgiana was staying at Matlock House?" Richard shrugged. "I don't know. She apparently went to Darcy House the day before, but they did not inform her where Georgiana was staying." "They must have let something slip. No one else could have told her." Darcy wondered if he could ask her. For the first time, he would... For the first time, he began to wonder if he dare mention her call on Georgiana, or if it might spoil the visit. But she knew Richard had been there, so she might be expecting him to talk about it. He hoped she would be there to receive his call, and not indisposed upstairs. He returned to Bingley. "Did you intimate that I would be calling with you today?" Bingley shook his head. Bingley shook his head. "I only said you had not yet been able to leave your quarters." Wonderful. Darcy sank gloomily back down against the cushions, cradling his left arm in the other. She must think he was a simpering old woman to have made the most of his She must think he was a simpering old woman to have made the most of his injury. They were there too soon for his mood, and yet not soon enough, for the motion of the coach had sent a flaming ache through his arm to his shoulder. He looked at the house as he carefully descended, deliberately ignoring the offered hand of the groom. Bingley had been right. It was a pleasant house, much more so than the address had led him to believe. He wondered whether Miss Elizabeth would be pleased to see him. Cool. Right. Get rid of that, save off. Right, I need to have a break because my articulators are getting tired, and so I shall go for a cup of tea, and I will probably be back here in about half an hour or so. As always, like, subscribe, go tell your friends, stuff like that. Hooray. See you soon. Bye.